It used to require a naval blockade to devastate a rival's economy, ships positioned in a strait, soldiers on a shoreline, months of military coordination. In 2026, it takes a single statement posted on the U.S. Treasury Department's website, a name added to a sanctions list, a bank cut off from the dollar clearing system, a semiconductor export license revoked. The entire economic output of a nation can be constrained without a single shot fired. That shift from military force to economic force as the primary weapon of great power competition is the most consequential change in geopolitics in the last 2 decades. And it reaches directly into the portfolio of every person holding a diversified index fund. This video explains how. I'm Warren. The series has covered external threats before. Japan's carry trade unwind in video 19, the Strait of Hormuz oil crisis in video 20, the tariff refund collision in video 27. Each of those was a single event with a single mechanism. This video is about the system underneath all of them, the architecture of economic warfare itself. Because once the system is visible, every future event, every sanction, every tariff, every export ban becomes legible as a move inside a larger structure. And legibility is protection. The investor who understands the structure doesn't panic when the next headline arrives. They recognize it. The framework comes from Edward Fishman, a former U.S. State Department sanctions official who now directs the Center for Geoeconomics at the Council on Foreign Relations. His book, Choke Points, which was a New York Times bestseller and Financial Times Book of the Year finalist, documents how the United States turned economic infrastructure into weapons over the past 2 decades. His latest piece in Foreign Affairs maps the current state of that transformation. The core concept is the choke point, a sector of the global economy that is so concentrated, so difficult to replace in the short term, and so asymmetric in its impact that controlling it gives one country extraordinary leverage over others. 3 choke points matter most for the person holding VTY and VXUS. The first is the dollar. Over 80% of international trade is denominated in US dollars. The dollar clearing system, which processes cross-border payments, runs through a small number of American correspondent banks. When the U.S. Treasury adds a foreign bank to the sanctions list, that bank loses access to dollar clearing. It can no longer process international payments. Its customers can no longer trade. The effect is immediate and devastating. When the U.S. sanctioned Iran's central bank in 2012, Iran's currency lost half its value in weeks. When Russian banks were cut from the SWIFT messaging system in 2022, Russia's economy contracted by over 2% in a single quarter. If you hold VTY, the dollar's reserve status is embedded in the portfolio's value. American companies earn revenue globally in a currency that the U.S. government controls. That's a structural advantage that no other market offers. Every time Apple sells an iPhone in Europe, every time Boeing delivers a jet to Asia, every time Pfizer ships medication to Latin America, the transaction settles in dollars. The companies inside VTY benefit from a currency that is simultaneously the world's medium of exchange and the world's most effective weapon. But it's also a risk because every time the dollar is weaponized, other countries have an incentive to build alternatives. China's cross-border payment system, CIPS, has grown from processing roughly $2 trillion in 2020 to over $15 trillion projected for 2026. Russia shifted a significant portion of its trade to yuan and rupees after 2022. India has expanded rupee-based trade agreements with over 20 countries. The dollar's dominance isn't disappearing, but it's being nibbled at, and the nibbling accelerates every time the weapon is used. Fishman calls this the overuse paradox. Every exercise of leverage creates incentives for the target to reduce its dependence on the choke point. The U.S. froze Russia's reserves and Russia built alternatives. The U.S. sanctioned Iran and Iran built oil-for-goods barter systems with China. The U.S. restricted chip exports and China invested over $100 billion in domestic semiconductor production. The weapon works in the short term. In the long term, it erodes the very infrastructure that makes it possible. If you've been watching the dollar's share of global reserves decline from roughly 71% in 2000 to roughly 58% today, that gradual decline is the overuse paradox operating in slow motion across 2 decades. The second choke point is semiconductors. Advanced chips, the kind that power AI systems, military hardware, and telecommunications infrastructure, are manufactured by a small number of companies concentrated in Taiwan, South Korea, and the Netherlands. The U.S. controls key segments of the supply chain through export licensing. When the Commerce Department restricted China's access to advanced chips in 2022, it cut off the country's ability to develop cutting-edge AI and military technology using equipment manufactured by ASML in the Netherlands, which depends on American components. That single restriction affected the technology trajectory of the world's second-largest economy. For the VXUS holder, semiconductor export controls matter because they directly affect the earnings of Asian tech companies. Chinese tech stocks, heavily weighted in VXUS through emerging market exposure, were impacted by the chip restrictions. Alibaba, Tencent, Baidu, and the broader Chinese tech sector lost significant market capitalization as investors priced in the long-term effect of restricted access to the most advanced chips. If you hold VXUS and checked the performance of the emerging markets portion over the past 3 years, the underperformance relative to VTY was partly driven by the chip choke point. At the same time, the restrictions benefited American and allied chip companies within VTY. NVIDIA, AMD, Applied Materials, and Lam Research all saw increased demand from customers racing to stockpile chips before further restrictions hit. The portfolio absorbed both effects simultaneously. The domestic side gained from reduced competition and increased urgency. The international side absorbed the cost of restricted access. Diversification, again, did what it was designed to do. Hold both sides of the trade and let the net effect be determined by the market, not by the investor's guess about which side would win. If you're wondering whether the chip war between the US and China will eventually hurt VT1 as China builds domestic alternatives, that's the overuse paradox again. China's SMIC is producing chips at older nodes. Huawei developed its own Kirin chipset despite restrictions. Every restriction accelerates the timeline for Chinese self-sufficiency, which means the choke point becomes less effective over time. The advantage embedded in VT1 today may erode over 10 to 20 years. The VXUS allocation hedges against that erosion by holding the companies that benefit from the shift. The third choke point is energy, and this is the one this series has covered most extensively. The Strait of Hormuz, oil priced in dollars, LNG export infrastructure concentrated in the United States and Qatar. The Iran blockade from Video 20 and the oil price dynamics from Video 27 are both expressions of the energy choke point in action. When the US Navy blockades Iranian ports, it's exercising control over a physical choke point. When the Treasury sanctions Iranian oil buyers, it's exercising control over a financial choke point. Both mechanisms reduce Iran's ability to sell oil, raise global prices, and create asymmetric effects that benefit American producers while hurting Asian importers. Here's where Fishman's framework delivers the insight that matters most for this channel. Not all economic weapons are equal. Tariffs are the weakest, sanctions are the strongest, and the difference explains why the IEEPA tariffs from Video 27 were struck down while Russian sanctions remain in full force. Tariffs are broad. They hit entire categories of goods across entire countries. The pain is diffuse, spread across millions of transactions, and the target can absorb and redirect trade with relative ease. Broad tariffs cost American consumers roughly $1,700 per household annually, according to the Congressional Joint Economic Committee. But they didn't force China to change any specific policy. They raised costs for both sides without producing the asymmetric pain that coercion requires. If you paid more for electronics, furniture, or clothing over the past year, that was the tariff hitting your side of the trade. The other side absorbed the cost too, but not enough to change behavior. That's why the Supreme Court struck them down. The weapon was too broad, too mutual, and too constitutionally questionable to survive legal challenge. Sanctions, by contrast, are surgical. They target specific banks, specific individuals, specific supply chains. The pain is concentrated. The target can't easily redirect because the choke point, the dollar clearing system, or the semiconductor supply chain, has no close substitute. When the US froze $300 billion of Russia's central bank reserves in 2022, there was no alternative system Russia could turn to. The reserves were held in dollars and euros at institutions that complied with the freeze. The weapon worked because the choke point was real. If you've been following this series and wondering why the Supreme Court struck down the tariffs but not the sanctions, this is the structural answer. The tariffs were imposed under emergency powers that the court found exceeded presidential authority. The sanctions were imposed under different statutes with broader legal support. But the deeper distinction is strategic. Tariffs are blunt instruments that impose mutual damage. Sanctions are precision instruments that impose asymmetric damage. The legal frameworks reflect that difference, and the market effects do too. What does all of this mean for the portfolio? 3 things consistent with every threat video in this series. First, economic warfare creates volatility, not destruction. The sanctions on Russia produced a sharp sell-off in Russian and European equities in early 2022. Within 6 months, VTY had recovered its pre-invasion levels. VXUS took longer because European energy dependence on Russia created a deeper structural adjustment. But by 12 months, both had recovered and resumed compounding. The pattern is the same across every economic warfare event: shock, volatility, recovery, compounding. The shock is real. The recovery is also real. And the person who sold during the shock missed the recovery. Second, the overuse paradox creates a slow structural shift that matters over decades. Every time the dollar is weaponized, the dollar's share of global reserves declines slightly. Every time semiconductor exports are restricted, China invests more in domestic chip production. Every time oil is weaponized, importers diversify their energy sources. These shifts are slow. They're measured in decades, not quarters. But they mean that the structural advantage embedded in VTY, the advantage of holding companies that operate in the world's reserve currency, may erode over 20 to 30 years. The portfolio doesn't need to change today, but the person holding it should understand that the terrain underneath it is shifting, and the shift is driven by the same weapons that create the short-term volatility. Third, the diversification across VTI and VXUS becomes more important, not less, as economic warfare intensifies. If the dollar's dominance erodes slowly, international equities in VXUS may benefit from the rebalancing of global capital flows. If semiconductor restrictions fragment the tech supply chain, some international companies may gain market share that was previously monopolized by US and allied firms. The portfolio that holds both domestic and international equities is hedged against the structural shift in either direction. The person who holds only VTY is betting that the choke points remain permanently in American hands. The person who holds VTY and VXUS is acknowledging that they might not. The economic war is already happening. It's been happening since the mid-2000s when US officials first weaponized the dollar clearing system against Iran's nuclear program. It accelerated after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It intensified with semiconductor export controls on China. And it reached a new chapter this week with the tariff refund portal, the Iran blockade, and the hawkish Fed all colliding simultaneously. If you're holding VTI and VXUS and wondering whether economic warfare changes what the portfolio should look like, the answer is, it already did. The portfolio from Video 10 was built with international diversification, specifically because the global economy isn't stable. The VXUS allocation exists to capture value from regions that may benefit as US choke point dominance erodes. The BND allocation exists to dampen volatility during the shocks that economic warfare produces. Every component of the 3-fund portfolio was designed with this terrain in mind, even before this video named the terrain explicitly. The person sitting inside this war, holding a diversified index fund portfolio with an automatic contribution and a daily protocol, is positioned exactly where Fishman's framework suggests a civilian should be. Diversified across geographies, exposed to both sides of the choke point equation, and insulated from the need to predict which weapon gets used next. The investor doesn't need to know whether the next sanctions target is Iran or China or Russia. The investor doesn't need to predict whether the next export ban hits chips or rare earths or software. The index holds all the companies that benefit and all the companies that are affected. The net effect, over any timeline longer than 12 months, is determined by compound interest, not by which government weaponized which choke point on which Tuesday. The architecture holds. The terrain is shifting. And the person who understands both of those facts simultaneously is the person who compounds through the war instead of being consumed by it.